The estate solicitor's office smelled like old paper and radiator heat, the kind of warmth that had nowhere to go and so just stayed, pressing down on everything. Nora stood at the front counter with her coat still buttoned, holding a folder of documents she had organized at 6 that morning in the kitchen while her mother slept. And she was listening to the woman behind the desk explain, for the second time, that the filing would need to be reviewed before the guardianship designation could be confirmed. "The what designation?" Nora said. "Guardianship." The woman, whose nameplate read Margaret Elms, did not look up. "There's a name listed in your father's estate file under the guardian field. It's a clerical discrepancy, most likely. Someone will need to review it." Nora set the folder on the counter, edge to edge with the counter's lip. "My father's been gone 8 months. This is the first I'm hearing of a guardian." "It may be nothing," Margaret said. "It may be a trustee designation that landed in the wrong field during processing. These things happen in estate transitions. I'll flag it for review." From somewhere behind her, in the row of chairs against the wall, Nora heard her mother's voice, pitched for the room and not for her. "She never reads the documents carefully. I've told her." Nora did not turn around. She thanked Margaret, picked up the folder, and walked back to her seat with the same unhurried step she would have used walking to her desk at work. And she sat down, and she smoothed the folder on her lap, and she did not say anything. Across the room, in the last chair of the row that ran along the far wall, a man in a plain grey suit was watching her. He was perhaps 50, or a little more, with steady hands resting on his knees, and an expression that held nothing dramatic in it, only attention. She did not notice him. She was looking at the folder. That was how it began. Not with a declaration or a discovery, but with a woman sitting quietly in a waiting room, holding documents her mother had just publicly criticized, in a building that held the last traces of her father's intentions, while a man she did not know kept his eyes on her and said nothing. Nora had worked at the Carlow Street Legal Aid Office for 4 years. She had come to it after her father's health had made travel impossible, after she had quietly set aside a position in commercial law that would have taken her to Edinburgh, after she had arranged her life around a household that ran on her effort and her mother's commentary in roughly equal measure. The Legal Aid Office served people who couldn't afford what she could have afforded to become, and she had found, with some surprise, that she was good at it in a way the commercial work had never quite allowed. Her desk was the one nearest the window that faced the back courtyard, where a sycamore tree had been fighting the building's shadow for years. She kept the desk very clean, 3 stacked trays on the left side for incoming, active and completed matters. A ceramic mug her father had given her that said nothing on it except for a small painted fox near the handle, and a photograph she had turned slightly so it faced the wall rather than the room, because the photograph was of her and her father at his 70th birthday, and she was not ready to have anyone ask about it. Clara Voss worked at the desk across the aisle. She had been at the office 9 years, which made her the institutional memory, the person who knew where the old case files actually lived, and which magistrate's clerk had a coffee preference, worth noting. Clara was in her late 30s, with the particular quality of someone who had decided long ago that most people were doing their best and extended them the benefit of the doubt accordingly, except when they weren't, at which point she became very exact about it. She was the only person in Nora's daily orbit who asked how she was, and then stopped talking, waiting to hear the answer. "You look like you came from somewhere difficult," Clara said on the morning after the estate office visit. She was not looking at Nora when she said it. She was refilling her coffee from the carafe on the filing cabinet. "Estate solicitors," Nora said. "There's a problem with my father's papers. Possibly a clerical error." Possibly meaning they're not sure yet. Meaning no one has looked closely enough to know. Clara came back to her desk and sat down. "Is your mother going with you when you go back?" Nora looked at her computer screen. She has opinions about the process. She always does, Clara said, not unkindly, and they went back to work. 3 days after the estate office visit, Nora returned alone on her lunch hour. She took the bus rather than the tube because the estate office was near a cluster of small sandwich places, and she had the thought that she could eat walking back if the review had gone well, which was the kind of modest optimism she had learned to keep very quiet. The waiting room was fuller than before. She took a number and sat, and after a few minutes, an elderly man came in, moving slowly with a leather briefcase that was clearly heavier than his frame was comfortable with. He stood inside the door looking at the counter, at the numbered chairs, at the briefcase, assessing the logistics of the situation. Nora stood up. "Here," she said. "The chairs fill fast near the counter. There's a better seat at the end of the row." She did not take the briefcase from him, because that would have been presumptuous. But she gestured toward the chair nearest the water dispenser, which was also the one with the most room, and walked with him until he was settled. "Thank you very much," he said. His name, she would eventually learn, was Harold Fenn, and he had been Richard Foster's solicitor for 23 years. He was here today in his personal capacity, handling a matter relating to the same estate she was here about, and he had seen her offer the chair before she'd said a word. She did not know any of that. She went back to her own seat with her number still in her hand. A man in a plain grey suit was watching from across the room. She noticed him this time, only because he happened to be in her line of sight when she sat down, and her eye registered the stillness of him before her mind had any particular opinion about it. He was not looking at her in the way people sometimes looked at a woman alone in a waiting room. He was looking at her in the way you looked at something you were trying to understand before you spoke to it. She looked back at the number in her hand. 7. They were on 4. The review, when it finally came, was conducted by a younger clerk who pulled the file with the professional speed of someone who had done exactly this on many occasions and had learned not to make it seem like news. The Guardian field was populated during probate transition, the clerk said. The name listed is a Richard Foster. The corresponding field for trustee is blank, which suggests the data migrated to the wrong category. We'll need to send a clarification notice to all named parties before we can amend. Nora wrote the name in the margin of her folder. Richard Foster. What does the designation mean, practically, in the meantime? Functionally very little while it's under review. It's not operative. It just exists in the record. And the named party has been notified. The notification would have gone out at the time of processing, 14 months ago. 14 months. Her father had been gone for 8 of them, which meant this had been placed in the record 6 months before he died, which meant it had not been an accident of grief administration. Someone had made a decision. She thanked the clerk and put the folder under her arm and walked out. The man in the grey suit had gone. He came back the following Tuesday and he came to Carlo Street. He opened the glass door of the legal aid office at 2:15 in the afternoon and stood at the small front desk where the intake forms lived in a wire rack. And the junior clerk, a young man named Marcus, who was working his way through a law degree on Tuesdays and Thursdays, handed him a form and told him someone would be with him shortly. Nora was the one who came out. She did not recognize him immediately, which she would later find both forgivable and slightly embarrassing. The waiting room of the estate office and the reception area of the legal aid office were different enough that her mind had not placed them together. He was wearing the same kind of suit, plain and well cut, but so were half the men who came in off the street needing help with a lease dispute or a benefits decision. "I'm Nora," she said. "Come through." He followed her to the small consultation room, which had 2 chairs and a table and a window that looked at the wall of the adjacent building, and he sat down and set the intake form on the table, and she looked at it. Richard Foster. He had written his name in clear, unornamented letters, first and last, and a phone number with a London exchange. She looked at the name for 1 second longer than she would have looked at a different name, but it was only 1 second, and she did not yet know why. "What can I help you with?" she said. "I'm here on behalf of someone who doesn't want to come in herself," he said. "An elderly neighbour. There's a matter with a tenancy dispute, and I wanted to understand her options before I recommend she take any further steps." His voice was measured, not clipped exactly, but clean, with the quality of someone who chose words by weight and did not overspend them. Nora pulled a fresh notepad toward her. "Tell me about the tenancy." They talked for 40 minutes. He knew enough about the situation to ask the right questions, and she knew enough about tenancy law to answer them completely. And somewhere in the middle of the second page of notes, she forgot to be curious about his name and simply became interested in the problem. That was the thing about Nora and a well-described legal situation. The problem got her full attention. When they were done, she tore out the top page, which was clean and organized in a way that would have served as advice in any competent firm, and handed it to him. "This should give her enough to make a decision," she said. He looked at the page for a moment and then at her. "Do you do this often? Take complicated situations and make them clear for people who can't pay you properly for it?" She picked up the notepad. "It's what the office is for." He folded the page and put it inside his jacket. He stood up and she stood up, and they were briefly in the small room together with nothing between them except the table and the early afternoon light, coming off the building's brick wall. "Thank you," he said. It was 2 words and they were plain, but the way he said them made them land as something more complete than courtesy. She showed him back to the front desk and watched him leave, and then she went to refill her coffee and found Clara standing by the carafe with an expression that was not quite a question. "Who was that?" Clara said. "A man with a neighbour who has a tenancy problem." Clara said, which was not an agreement. He came back the following Friday. This time he said the neighbour had followed her advice and the landlord had responded, and there were new complications. And could she look at the response letter? She said yes. They sat in the same room with the same window and the same wall, and she read the letter twice, once for content and once for tone, and told him what the landlord was actually doing, which was different from what the letter said. "The letter claims a code compliance issue," she said. "The actual concern is that your neighbour has been there 11 years without a rent review, and they see an opportunity. What would you advise? Counter the code claim with the building inspection record. If there isn't one, request one. In the meantime, document everything, every conversation, every visit, every maintenance request. Paper makes arguments that people can't." He wrote something in a small notebook he had brought this time. She noticed that he wrote quickly and in a very small hand, the kind of handwriting that suggested someone who had filled a lot of pages over a long time. "You have a photograph turned toward the wall," he said. She looked up. "I apologize," he said immediately. "I shouldn't have said that." "No," she said. "It's all right." She paused. "It's my father. He died 8 months ago. I'm not ready to explain him to people." He did not say he was sorry, which was the thing most people said and which she had found exhausting. He said, was he the kind of person who needed explaining? She sat with that for a moment. "Yes," she said. "He was complicated and generous, and he made decisions I don't fully understand yet." He closed the notebook. "That sounds like someone worth taking the time to understand properly." She thought about the name in the estate file. She thought about the clerk's voice saying 14 months ago. She did not say anything. Clara was waiting at the front when she came out, with the expression that had moved past not quite a question into something more definite. "He's been here twice," Clara said. "His neighbour has an ongoing situation." "Nora." Clara held her coffee mug in both hands. I've been here 9 years. Men with tenant disputes for elderly neighbours do not come back twice. They take the advice, and they're grateful, and they leave. Perhaps his situation is more complicated. Perhaps, Clara said, or perhaps something else is happening and you're the last one to know about it. Nora said nothing. She went back to her desk and looked at the sycamore tree in the courtyard, which was moving slightly in a wind she couldn't feel from inside, and she thought about complicated and generous, and decisions she didn't understand yet, and she kept the thought at the edge of her mind where she could see it without looking directly at it. 2 evenings later, her mother came into the kitchen while she was washing up and set a sheet of paper on the counter beside the dish rack. Preston came by, Diane said. He left an itinerary for Saturday. Dinner at the Langley, 7 o'clock. Nora kept her hands in the water. I haven't agreed to Saturday. You haven't disagreed to it either, and at this point, I think we've had quite enough of that arrangement. Preston Hale was a man her mother had located through what Nora's father would have called a systematic audit of the available inventory, meaning the set of men in their social circle who had money and were unmarried and would do. He was not unkind in any particular way. He was simply absent, even in the same room, performing the role of a man who mattered with the full effort of someone who needed the performance to be believed. I'm not going to marry Preston, Nora said. She said it the way she said most things, level and without ornament. Your father's estate is under review, Diane said. Your position in this house is under review. You are 28 years old and you are in no position to be particular. Nora dried her hands on the dish towel. My position in this house is not under review. It's my home. The guardianship question changes that. Her mother picked up the sheet of paper and set it in the middle of the counter where it would have to be moved. Whoever they've named in that file has standing that you don't have at the moment. Until it's cleared up, you are legally adjacent to being managed, and I would rather that arrangement was settled than left dangling. It was not legally accurate. Nora knew that. But her mother delivered legal inaccuracies with the confidence of someone who had never had them successfully challenged. She picked up the itinerary and read it. Dinner at the Langley, 7 o'clock. She put it back on the counter and went to her room, and she sat on the edge of her bed in the dark and looked at the window, and she did not feel particularly anything, which was worse than feeling something specific. The call came on a Thursday, from a number she didn't have saved. She almost didn't pick up. She was eating lunch alone in the small kitchen at the back of the legal aid office, a sandwich she had made that morning from bread that was slightly stale but which she had toasted so it didn't matter, and the phone was on the table and she looked at it and then picked it up. Nora, the voice said. It was him. Yes, she said. I want to apologize in advance for what I'm about to say, he said. I know it falls outside the professional scope of what you've been helping me with. She set down the sandwich. All right. I think you should know that the situation you're in is not what you believe it to be. Not the tenancy situation. Your situation. The kitchen was very quiet. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere in the main office, Marcus was on a call. Can you say more than that? She said. Not on the phone, and not as a client. If you'd be willing to meet me somewhere outside this context, I can explain properly. She looked at the far wall of the kitchen, which had a motivational poster someone had put up years ago that said something about persistence, and which she had always found faintly annoying. There's a coffee place on Carlo Street, she said. Markham's. Tomorrow at noon. He said yes. He hung up. She picked up the sandwich and finished it, and she sat with a precise, low alertness that she recognized as the feeling of knowing something was about to change without knowing its shape yet. She did not get the chance to meet him at Markham's. That evening she came home later than usual and let herself in through the back door, which she used when her mother was entertaining, because the front hallway carried sound all the way up the stairs. She was going to take off her coat and go up quietly, but as she passed the sitting room, she heard her mother's voice through the partially open door, and then Preston's voice answering, and then a sentence she had to stop and listen to again inside her own mind to be sure she had heard it correctly. "She has no one who will stand for her," her mother was saying. "I've looked at the estate paperwork carefully. The guardianship name is a clerical error. No one has come forward to assert it in 14 months. There is no one in her corner with any real authority. The engagement can proceed." Nora stood in the hallway with her coat still on, and her bag still over her shoulder, and her hand near the wall switch she hadn't touched. Preston said, "And she won't simply agree?" "She'll come around," her mother said. "She doesn't have a choice that looks better than this one." Nora moved away from the door. She went upstairs without turning on any lights. She sat on her bed again. Same edge, same window, same dark. And this time, she felt something very specific, which was a kind of cold clarity. The way a room feels when you open a window in February, and the heat goes immediately, and the air is very clean and very still. Her mother had looked at the paperwork. Her mother had assessed the landscape and found it empty. Her mother was going to arrange her life the way she arranged furniture, for appearance, with no particular consideration for whether the furniture was comfortable. She sat there for a long time. When she finally moved, it was to take off her coat, fold it over the chair by the window, and pick up her phone. She typed a message to the number she had saved that afternoon. "Still the address you said tomorrow?" "Yes," he wrote back. Noon. She set the phone on the nightstand and lay down without turning on the lamp, and she looked at the ceiling, and she thought about her father writing a name into a legal document 6 months before he died, and she thought about decisions she didn't understand yet, and she thought about the particular quality of someone who did not fill silences. In the morning, she went to work. She completed 2 client reviews and a benefit appeal, and she had a conversation with Clara that was about case files on the surface and about something else underneath, in the way their conversations sometimes were. "The man who came in for the tenancy matter," Clara said, not looking up from her screen. "He called yesterday," Nora said. Clara looked up. "We're meeting today," Nora said. "Good," Clara said, as though this were a conclusion she had already reached and was only waiting to hear confirmed. Nora arrived at Markham's 4 minutes early. He was already there in a chair at the back of the room where he could see the door, with 2 cups of coffee on the table that had been there long enough to stop steaming. She sat down. "There isn't an elderly neighbour," she said. "No," he said. She picked up the coffee, which was the temperature of something made with intention, and then had to wait. "Tell me." He told her. He told her about the estate filing, about the clerical migration of data, about his name landing in the Guardian field when it had been intended for the trustee line, and then the trustee line going blank. He told her that he had received the notification 14 months ago, and that he had come to the estate office the following week to discuss the situation, and that while he was waiting, he had watched a woman stand at the counter and be told there was a discrepancy in her father's papers, and the woman had thanked the clerk and walked back to her seat without flinching, and the woman's mother had said something cutting from across the room, and the woman had sat down with her folder on her lap and looked at nothing in particular with an expression of quiet, disciplined stillness. "And you didn't correct the error?" she said. "No." "Why?" He wrapped both hands around his cup. "Because I went back to my office and I looked at the original filing, and I realized the error wasn't a migration error. The trustee field was populated first, and then the Guardian field, and your father's handwriting was in the Guardian field. He wrote my name there himself. The clerical system copied it incorrectly. I was supposed to be the trustee, but he chose the other word deliberately." She was quiet. "I didn't correct it," he said, because I wanted to understand what he intended, and because I had already seen you in that waiting room, and I needed to understand that too, before I said anything official. She thought about her father. She thought about complicated and generous and decisions she didn't understand. She thought about a man who had known enough to choose carefully, even at the end. He knew you, she said. It was not a question. We were in a business matter together 7 years ago. It didn't go anywhere significant, commercially. But we talked a great deal during it about the kind of things people talk about when they're sitting across a table from someone for long hours. He talked about you often. She looked at her coffee, at her. She looked at the window which faced the street and let in the grey light of a November afternoon. What did he say? That you were precise and kind in equal measure, and that he wished the world around you would catch up to that. He paused. I thought, when I saw you in that waiting room, that the world hadn't caught up yet. She didn't say anything for a moment. Outside, a bus went past. The coffee place was warm and low-lit and smelled like ground beans and old wood. My mother is staging an engagement announcement, she said finally. Saturday. She's invited 30 people. She believes the guardianship is inoperative and that I have no one who will stand for me. He held her gaze steadily. I know. How? Harold Fenn, my solicitor, has been monitoring the estate filing. He flagged increased activity on the record this week. He paused. He was also the elderly man in the waiting room the second time you were at the estate office, the one you helped find a seat. She looked at him. He told me about it afterward, he said. I didn't ask him to watch for anything. He simply noticed, and he told me. She picked up her coffee and drank the rest of it and set the cup down precisely in its ring. Saturday, she said. The Langley, 7 o'clock. I know, he said. I'm going to refuse Preston regardless of whether you come, she said. I want you to know that. I know that too, he said. And something in his voice that had been held at a careful distance shifted very slightly, the way a door shifts in a frame before it opens. On Saturday, she put on the grey dress she wore when she wanted to feel contained and certain, which was not the dress her mother had left on the hanger outside her bedroom door. She did her hair the way she did it for court appearances, neat and back, and she looked at herself in the mirror once and then went downstairs. Her mother was in the sitting room, already in the black coat she saved for events she considered important. You look perfectly acceptable, Diane said. Nora picked up her bag. Thank you, she said, meaning nothing by it. The Langleys' private dining room was arranged for exactly 30 guests, which was a number her mother had chosen for its atmosphere of deliberateness, suggesting something planned well in advance. The table was set with candles, and the kind of heavy cutlery that existed to make an occasion feel settled before it had been decided. Preston was standing near the window when they arrived, in a suit that was trying very hard, and he kissed her cheek in the way of a man claiming a territory rather than greeting a person. The solicitor arrived at 7:30. He came in the side door, which was the door the catering staff used, and Nora saw him before anyone else did, which meant she saw him walking through the room toward the primary table with a folder under his arm and an expression of complete professional calm. She recognized him from the estate office waiting room, and her chest went very still. Harold Fenn. He was followed at a short distance by Richard in a suit that was the same quality as all his suits and therefore was not announcing anything, only being what it was. Her mother turned from a conversation near the window. Her eyes moved to Harold, then to Richard, with the assessing speed of someone who had spent a lifetime reading rooms for rank. Mr. Fenn, she said. There was a question at the back of it. Harold set the folder on the table beside the centerpiece. Mrs. Calloway, I apologize for coming to a social occasion with a professional matter. The estate review has concluded, and the finding is time-sensitive. I thought it best to address it before the evening went further. The room had not gone quiet yet. Several conversations continued near the far end of the table, but the people nearest the centre had begun to attend. "This could have waited until Monday," Diane said. "It could have," Harold said pleasantly. "But as the named guardian has been present in your daughter's life in recent weeks, and has not been formally introduced in that capacity, it seemed appropriate to correct that before announcements of any kind were made." Now the room went quiet. Preston set down his glass. Harold opened the folder. He read from the first document in a tone that was neither elevated nor diminished, only precise. He named the filing date, which was 14 months prior. He named the estate. He named the guardian field and the notation it contained. And then he said the name. Richard Foster. The woman beside Diane said something low. The man across from Preston looked at Richard with the sharp recalibration of someone who had just placed a face he recognized from somewhere other than a dining room. Her mother's mouth opened very slightly and then closed. "The designation is operative," Harold continued. "It was incorrectly classified during probate processing, but the original document reflects Mr. Calloway's clear handwriting. The intent was unambiguous. Mr. Foster has held this designation for 14 months and has not corrected the record because, in his assessment, no action was required until such time as the designation's implications became pertinent." Preston said, "I'm not sure I understand what this means practically." "It means," Richard said, speaking for the first time in the room, his voice carrying without effort, "that Nora has someone in her corner. It means it was always the case. The paperwork simply hadn't been read by the right people." He looked at Nora when he said it. Not at Preston, not at her mother, not at the room. At Nora. She held his gaze. Her mother looked at her, and then at Richard, and then at her daughter again with the expression of someone reconstructing a room they thought they understood completely. It was not a dramatic collapse. It was quieter than that, and therefore worse. It was the expression of someone discovering that the furniture they had arranged with such care had been moved without their permission, and the room without it looked different, and they could not entirely explain why. "Robert," Diane said, which was Nora's father's name, said the way you said a name when you had just understood something about a person that you should have understood years ago. "He was thorough," Harold said simply. "He usually was." Preston set his glass down on the table and straightened his jacket, and Nora watched him perform a small, dignified retreat from the center of the room toward its periphery. He did not leave immediately because leaving immediately would have required him to acknowledge too directly what had just occurred, and so instead he moved to the far end of the table and began a conversation about something else entirely. And within 20 minutes he had made his way to the door and was gone. The evening continued. It had to, because 30 people and a set table do not dissolve simply because the expected script no longer applies. And so people talked, and the caterers served the first course, and her mother managed herself with the iron discipline of someone who had never in her life allowed a room to see her rattled. But she did not use Preston's name again that evening. She did not speak about arrangements or itineraries or positions under review. She sat at the head of the table, and she was very correct and very contained. And at one point during the second course, she looked at Nora across the length of the table, and something moved in her expression that was close enough to acknowledgement to count. Nora sat beside Richard. They did not speak about the legal documents or the estate filing or the 14 months or any of it. They talked about the food, which was better than she had expected, and about the sycamore tree she had described to him once during their second consultation, which was apparently a variety that the shadow would eventually defeat, though it would take another decade. "My father loved trees that were fighting," she said. "I know," Richard said. "He told me." She looked at her wine glass. She thought about a man who had filled a field with careful decisions and trusted that someone would find them. He chose well, she said quietly, meaning it as a statement about her father's intent and also perhaps as something else, and he received it in the full weight of both meanings without needing to say anything at all. Clara was at the legal aid office on Monday when Nora arrived. She was already at her desk, both hands around her coffee mug, and she looked up when Nora came in and registered whatever it was in Nora's face that was different from Friday. "Tell me," Clara said. Nora sat down at her desk. She turned the photograph on her desk to face the room, the one of her and her father at his 70th birthday, his arm around her shoulders, both of them slightly squinting in the afternoon light. She straightened it so it was parallel with the edge of the tray stack. She told Clara the shape of it, the clerical error, the 14 months, the name in the Guardian field, the man who had come in twice about a tenancy problem that was never about a tenancy. Clara listened without interrupting, which was one of her specific abilities, the kind of listening that did not fill the spaces with its own opinions, but held them open. "He came in twice," Clara said finally, when Nora was done. "Yes. Men with tenant disputes for elderly neighbours don't come back twice," Clara said. "No," Nora said. "They don't." Clara lifted her mug. "I knew something was different about him." She paused. "Did you?" Nora looked at the photograph. Her father, slightly squinting with the expression of someone who had just told a joke that required patience to land properly. "I think I noticed something," she said. "I didn't know what I was noticing." "That's usually how it goes," Clara said, and turned back to her screen. 2 days later, on a Wednesday morning that had the particular low grey light of late autumn pressing against the windows, Richard came to the legal aid office again. Not as a client. He came in and asked Marcus at the front desk if Nora had a moment, and Marcus looked through the glass partition, and she nodded, and he came through. They stood in the small consultation room with its 2 chairs and its table and its window that faced the building's brick wall. And she realized she had not eaten yet, that she had come in before the coffee was even ready, and that none of that seemed to matter in any particular way. "I wanted to come in person," he said, "not by phone." "All right." He stood with his hands at his sides, which was how he stood when he was not performing anything at all. "I should have told you who I was when you first came to the estate office. I know that." "You should have," she said. "I watched you absorb 3 separate unkind things in the space of 8 minutes, he said, "and you didn't flinch. And when you went back to your seat, you organized your folder, and I thought about what your father had said about you. And I didn't want to introduce myself as the man whose name was in your paperwork. I wanted to understand if the person he described to me was still that person when no one was watching." She looked at him. "No one was watching," she said, "except you." "Yes," he said, "I was watching." The sycamore in the courtyard was very still. The light coming off the brick wall had the quality of something that would not get any warmer today, and she stood in it, and she thought about her father at 70, slightly squinting, trusting that the things he had put in place would eventually land where they were supposed to. "I want to know what he said about me," she said, "when he talked about me." Richard reached into his jacket and produced the small notebook, the one with the close, careful handwriting. He opened it to a page near the middle, and she saw her name written there in his hand, with several lines beneath it that she was not close enough to read, and she understood that the notes were from a conversation 7 years ago that he had thought worth keeping. He held the notebook out to her. She took it, and she looked at it, and her father's intentions came into focus the way they do when you finally hold the thing a complicated and generous person was pointing at all along, not loudly, not with ceremony, but with the patient certainty of someone who had always believed the world would catch up eventually. She handed the notebook back. He did not put it away immediately. He held it for a moment, and then he set it on the table between them, in the way you set something down when you expect to pick it back up. She left the legal aid office at 5:30 and walked down Carlo Street in the grey November air toward the bus stop, and she passed the estate solicitor's office, which was closed now, its glass door dark. She stopped in front of it for a moment. She looked at her reflection in the glass, and at the shapes of the waiting room chairs visible beyond it, and at the chair at the end of the far row where an elderly man had been sitting 14 months ago, watching a name migrate to the wrong field of a document with the patience of someone who understood that some things arrived exactly where they were meant to arrive, only sideways. The door was locked. She had no reason to go in. She turned, and Richard was standing on the pavement a few feet behind her, his hands in his coat pockets, not having announced himself, only there. She looked at him, standing in front of the glass, her reflection and his beside each other in the darkened door, the warm light from Carlo Street behind them both. "He was right," she said, "about you." Richard held her gaze in the same quiet, complete way he had in the estate office all those months ago when she had not known she was being seen. She turned from the door and walked beside him up the street, and the evening settled around them, ordinary and unremarkable and exactly what it was, and that was enough.